Welcome back to The Explainer. Look, if you're here, I already know you're a focused learner ready to cut through the noise and get right to the core of things. And today, well, we are settling into a really profoundly contemplative space. We're going to unpack the foundational ideas of literally one of the most famous, widely read spiritual texts of our modern era. So go ahead, take a deep breath, kind of clear your mental slate, and let's get ready to explore the actual nature of our own consciousness.
Okay, let's just jump right in with a remarkably intense quote. I cannot live with myself any longer. If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me. Now you might be thinking, what does that even mean? But this isn't just some abstract philosophical riddle. No, this was an actual desperate thought that kept repeating on loop in the mind of the author we're looking at today, right in the middle of a massive personal crisis. It brilliantly introduces the core existential puzzle we're going to explore in this explainer. Who exactly is the I, and who is the self that I absolutely cannot tolerate?
The person asking that intense question was Eckhart Tolle. And the book born from that profound, life-altering realization? That's The Power of Now. It became a massive, undisputed #1 New York Times bestseller. But why? Well, its teachings tackle an absolute epidemic that affects, quite honestly, almost every single one of us. That relentless, exhausting noise of our own minds. Tolle provides this incredible framework for mental stillness that has resonated so deeply with millions of modern readers. People who are just desperately seeking some personal growth and a way to escape their own internal monologue.
What's really wild to me are the super humble origins of this massive phenomenon. Picture this, back in 1997, the very first run by a small publisher in Vancouver was just 3,000 copies. That's it. Tolle literally used to personally hand-deliver a few copies every week to small local bookstores. But, through the late 90s, the idea spread like wildfire. It became this totally underground, word-of-mouth sensation. People were passing it to friends simply because it was fundamentally changing their lives. Then Oprah Winfrey found it. She was deeply affected by it, and her endorsement absolutely catapulted the book onto the global stage. To put that growth into perspective, by 2004, the text we're exploring today had been translated into 30 different languages.
Now, a massive shift in consciousness like that doesn't usually happen without some pushback, right? And it's important for us to neutrally examine the polarized reception this book got, because while millions of people reported a total disappearance of their suffering after actually putting these teachings into practice, the mainstream media sometimes had a wildly different take. Time magazine, for instance, they dismissed the book entirely, literally calling it mumbo-jumbo. Tolle actually notes in the text that any teaching putting a spotlight on the ego will inevitably provoke resistance. So the divide was crystal clear. Some folks couldn't even get past the first few pages, while others found those exact same pages to be absolutely life-changing.
Moving right along to Section 1, Tolle's Dark Night and Awakening.
See, before he was this globally recognized spiritual guide, Tolle was just an ordinary guy trapped in a really severe prison of psychological pain. Literally, up until his 30th year, his life was defined by almost continuous anxiety. And this was interspersed with really dark periods of suicidal depression. He describes waking up in the early hours with just this heavy, absolute dread, feeling like the world was utterly alien, hostile, and totally meaningless. His suffering got so intense that his longing for non-existence actually overpowered his instinct to stay alive. And I think knowing that is absolutely crucial, because it grounds all of his subsequent spiritual insights in very real, very raw human struggle. Which brings us right back to that terrifying night shortly after his 29th birthday, and that quote we started with. Am I one or two? His intense suffering literally forced a massive cognitive break. He realized, if he couldn't live with himself, there had to be two entities, an I, the subject, and a self, the object he was evaluating. And then, a sudden thought hit him. Wait, maybe only one of them is actually real.
What happened next is basically the core of his whole awakening. Tolle writes that he was so stunned by this realization that his mind just stopped. He was fully conscious, but there were no more thoughts. First, the thought stream halted. Then he felt drawn into what he described as a spinning vortex of energy. He was gripped by this intense fear, but then he heard these words inside his chest, just saying, resist nothing. Finally, letting go of all that fear, he allowed himself to essentially fall into the void. His consciousness had completely withdrawn from his deeply fearful, unhappy mind. He says he actually has no recollection of what happened immediately after that, but the next morning, he was awakened by the chirping of a bird outside his window. Except it was different. He had never really heard a sound quite like that before. Everything around him felt fresh, pristine, and just illuminated by love. He walked around the city that whole day in utter amazement, marveling at the sheer miracle of life on Earth, honestly as if he had just been born into the world. That false, suffering self he carried around had completely collapsed,
kind of like a deflated toy.
And get this, for 2 whole years following this event, Eckhart Tolle spent his days just sitting on park benches. 2 years. He had 0 relationships, no job, no home, and absolutely no socially defined identity left whatsoever. Yet he spent all that time in a state of the most intense, uninterrupted joy and deep peace. He had clearly tapped into something profound. And eventually, people just started approaching him on those benches, asking how they could possibly get the peace he so obviously had.
This brings us to Section 2. You are not your mind.
So, pivoting from Tolle's personal journey, let's look at the universal lesson he distilled from it. A lesson that applies directly to you and me. He uses this really powerful metaphor to explain it. Picture this. A beggar had been sitting on an old box by the side of a road for over 30 years. Now, this guy is the ultimate symbol of humanity's desperate search for external fulfillment, right? Constantly asking the world to just toss him a few scraps of happiness.
Then, one day, a stranger walks by. The beggar, totally out of habit, mechanically asks for some spare change. The stranger looks at him and says he has nothing to give him. But then, the stranger asks a very simple, kind of weird question. "What's that you are sitting on?" The beggar just dismisses it. "Oh, just an old box," he says. "I've been sitting on it for as long as I can remember." The stranger persists and asks, "Ever looked inside?"
So the beggar manages to pry open the lid, and to his absolute astonishment, disbelief, and sheer elation, he sees that the box he has literally been sitting on for 3 decades is completely filled with gold. Tolle explains that he, the author, is that stranger. He has nothing external to hand you. He is simply telling you to look inside yourself for the immense wealth you already possess, instead of constantly begging the world for validation.
So what exactly is this gold? Well, Tolle defines this inner wealth as the radiant joy of being and the deep, unshakable peace that comes along with it. He argues that anyone who hasn't found this true inner wealth is essentially a beggar, even if they have immense material wealth. Because people are constantly looking outside for scraps of pleasure or security or love, completely ignoring this massive treasure inside them that is infinitely greater than anything the outside world could ever offer.
Now, this realization of inner wealth brings us to a heavily loaded word, enlightenment. I know, it sounds intense, but Tolle completely strips away all that intimidating, superhuman baggage we usually attach to the concept. For him, enlightenment is simply your natural state of felt oneness with being. He actually loves the Buddha's remarkably simple definition: it's just the end of suffering. That's it. There's no magical superpower involved, it's just an end to the illusion of separation.
But hey, if it's our natural state, why is it so incredibly rare? Well, the greatest obstacle is our identification with our own minds. That is the core problem blocking our peace. It causes our thinking to become totally compulsive. Tolle actually writes that not being able to stop thinking is a dreadful affliction. But the catch is, we don't realize it because pretty much everybody is suffering from it, so we just assume it's normal. It's this continuous, incessant mental noise that keeps us from finding that realm of inner stillness.
All right, let's move to Section 3, Finding Peace in the Now.
So, how do we actually fix this? To access this peace, we really need to understand 2 completely contrasting states of existence. On one side, you've got the compulsive thinker. This person lives in a state of apparent separateness, totally trapped in this insanely complex world of continuous problems and conflicts. Then, on the other side, we have the state of being, or enlightenment. This is a state of total wholeness, of truly being at one, and therefore at complete total peace.
And this actually leads us to where Western civilization kind of took a wrong turn. You know the famous philosopher Descartes? He believed he had found the ultimate, most fundamental truth when he made his iconic statement, "I think, therefore I am." But according to Tolle, Descartes actually gave expression to the most basic error possible. He equated thinking with being, and identity with thinking. By believing we literally are our thoughts, we end up completely enslaved by them.
When you identify entirely with your mind, you create what Tolle calls an opaque screen. And this screen is built out of concepts, labels, images, words, and judgments. It acts like this constant mental filtration system that comes between you and yourself, between you and your fellow humans, and even between you and nature itself. It creates the total illusion of separateness. You might intellectually believe that everything is connected, sure, but as long as you're trapped behind this heavy screen of words and labels, you just don't feel that oneness as a self-evident reality anymore.
So the solution here is beautifully simple, though. Let's be honest, not always easy. When your attention is fully and intensely in the now, being can be felt.
But, and this is a big but, it can never be understood mentally. You literally cannot think your way into this state. You have to step out of psychological time. You must stop trying to grasp your true nature with your analytical mind. Because you can only truly know it when the mind is finally, completely still.
Which leaves us with a final, absolutely vital question to ponder. Are you ready to stop identifying with that voice in your head and finally open the box of gold you're already sitting on? The wealth is right there. The peace is there. It's just waiting for you to silence the noise and simply be. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the power of now. I really hope this explainer has given you a clear, structured understanding of these incredibly profound concepts. Keep learning, keep focusing, and I'll see you next time.